Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters, and for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business, policy, and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. You should check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web, at safecampaudio on social media. On this week's podcast, we talked to Jody Kent Lavy, who for a little while longer is the co-executive director of the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth. She talks to us about the continuing fight to get rid of juvenile life without parole sentences. You also often hear that referred to as JL-WOP sentences. We talked about the more ground level fight to replace those types of sentences with meaningful chances at parole for youth who commit serious crimes, and a whole bunch more. I would just add tangentially, also check out Jody's co-executive director, Xavier McElrath-Bay, who wrote a great column in Teen Vogue recently calling for an end to JL-WOP sentences. I'll drop a link to Xavier's op-ed in the show notes. Before we get to that, let's do a few quick headlines for the week. As the Imprint's Michael Fitzgerald reported on last week, newly released census data shows that the percent of children living in poverty spiked right after a slate of aid attached to COVID-era pandemic support was phased out. So what the 2022 data that was released last week shows is that the overall poverty rate for kids rose from just over 5% in 2021, and that is a historic low, 5% child poverty in 2021, to roughly 12% in 2022, and that is the steepest rise on record. 7 percentage points is quite a bit. For kind of a broader context, though, we're talking about the supplemental poverty measure, which kind of prices in the many different ways in which we help low-income families and families that would be below the poverty level through things like welfare payments or food stamps or local assistance, earned income tax credits, child tax credits. All those things are factored in to say, if you look at the picture of what are people making and getting as assistance, how many people are above the poverty level. So it's based on that. And, the historical context of that is in the 90s, we were at something like 30% child poverty. So that went way down and was around 11%, I believe, right before the COVID era family supports, like the advanced child tax credit, took effect. So it was down 11 and then went down to, like I said, 5%, over the course of 2021. Now back to 12%. So as I just mentioned, chief among these COVID supports was this advanced child tax credit, which we've always had we've had a child tax credit for some time in America. This kind of went well beyond the parameters of the traditional child tax credit. It first was paid out monthly if a parent wanted that, and also didn't really have any income restrictions. So the child tax credit, is limited and traditionally to people who are earning, I think, over $10,000 or more. This child tax credit during the first part of the pandemic, at least through 2021, was available to really all parents. So even if you were not making any money. So this new data certainly seems to suggest some causality between the child tax credit and child poverty. It might be overstating it a bit to say that, the child tax credit alone is worth a 7 percentage point drop in child poverty, but it's not too far overstating the case. And it would probably be reasonable to hypothesize also that were an advanced version of the child tax credit similar to the one in the COVID era supports, around for a sustained period, that you might have second and third order effects on generational poverty. This would seem to be quite a ringing endorsement of the child tax credit, but the question is there bipartisan interest and a bipartisan path to establishing a more permanent version of it than the one that was included in the COVID package? I think it was part of the Build Back Better. There were so many. On the first prong of that bipartisan interest, there already has been. Senator Mitt Romney, soon to not be a senator anymore, retiring, not the best barometer for what the Republican Party in general has an appetite for, and he is leaving soon. But he did propose a plan for a child tax credit that ran through the Social Security office is actually more generous in certain ways to the lowest income families in terms of like the yearly amount than what ended up in the Build Back Better plan. And this is, in my opinion, this would be the sticking point. Senator Romney's plan pays for the cost of these tax credits in part by cutting into other fiscal support programs for families, one of them being the earned income tax credit. So he is, his proposal anyway, was to establish this tax credit, which would pay out monthly. I think it was $4,200 a year at the highest point, but would sap a little bit out of, not a little bit, a pretty significant amount for some families, out of the earned income tax credit and some other human services programs that go to states, I think. And this is really, to me, what it comes down to is there is a path potentially to bipartisan interest and agreement around the concept of a child tax credit that would be more robust than what we have now. I think that would have to, if you held the premise that it would have to pass with bipartisan support and you weren't going to wait till a situation where one party dominated all chambers and of the legislature and the White House to the point where they were able to kind of move one through by themselves, you're going to need Republican support, and I would guess that's really going to have to come with pay-fors. No one on that side is probably going to create a child tax credit completely out of money that is not already somehow factored into the Treasury, So we'll stay tuned on that. I mean, I am interested though in whether this news about the very clear shift downward and then upward in child poverty, which is obviously pegged to some level to the COVID support, get some discussions going in Washington. We'll see. We have discussed on the podcast before the various lawsuits challenging recent state legislation that bans the provision of gender-affirming care and gender-affirming surgeries for minors. Well, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals has agreed to take on a case that some believe is destined for the Supreme Court. And this one pertains to rules around healthcare plans and gender-affirming care as opposed to, just legislation banning it. This is more about, is it okay or is it lawful and constitutional to exclude gender-affirming care in some way from a healthcare plan? One part of this case, it's kind of a combo of two different cases within the circuit. One case stems from North Carolina's state employees' health insurance denying gender-affirming care. And then the other side of the case is West Virginia blocking its state Medicaid plan for paying for treatments and services under the kind of rubric of gender-affirming care. So the laws banning gender-affirming care really all focus on children, right? They're not focused on what adults do or choose to do. This case applies to all people, kids and adults who are seeking gender-affirming care, either for themselves or on behalf of somebody in their family through their health plan. And because many families are not in a position to pay for care outside of their health plan, this is going to have real consequences for children. So we'll keep an eye on that and keep you updated as this case moves its way through the federal circuit court and maybe to the Supreme Court. A few months ago on the podcast, we mentioned that after taking testimony from adoptees living in the United States and Europe, the South Korea Truth and Reconciliation Commission launched an investigation into dozens of cases that involved kids who may have been wrongly removed from their families and then placed into international adoptions. I would strongly recommend the reporting of Chae Sang-hun of the New York Times from last week. I'm going to drop a link to his story in the show notes because it really brings to life the experiences that prompted this commission. I'm just going to read the first few paragraphs for you just to give you a taste here. This is an anecdote that kind of leads a story about a young woman named Mia Lee Sorensen. Mia Lee Sorensen's Danish parents used to tell her that her birth family in South Korea had put her up for adoption. According to her adoption papers, she was born prematurely in 1987 to a family that could not afford her medical bills and wished for her to have a, quote, good future abroad. But when Miss Sorensen found her birth parents in South Korea last year, they could not believe she was alive. They told her that her mother had passed out during labor and that when she woke up, the clinic told her that the baby had died. So again, I will drop a link to this really powerful story in the show notes. And, I think this is something that's coming for a lot of countries. South Korea certainly is one of the countries that has been most prolific historically in terms of international adoption and sending children away. Ireland also has a similar commission kind of up and running. And, I don't think it would be crazy to see the United States having something like this in place, sometime in the near future. All right, when we come back, our interview with Jody Kent Lavy.
Foster Power is a movement to improve the lives and futures of youth in Florida's foster care system by creating access to information on their benefits, protections, and legal rights. Foster Power is the first app of its kind nationwide and was made by lawyers with youth input. Visit fosterpower.org/app to download the free mobile app today.
We are joined today by Jody Kent Lavy, who co-founded the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing for Youth in 2009 to push back against the use of juvenile life without parole sentences. And this fall will leave that role. We'll talk to her more about what she's going to do next. Kind of still involves them. That she helped create 14 years ago. So we're going to talk about the campaign's origins, strategy, how the Supreme Court is inextricably linked to all of this on this issue, and a very big milestone that was recently reached. So, Jody, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly podcast.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Let's get them to know you a little bit before we start talking about serious stuff. You got to give me at least one of your favorites. Here are the categories: book, movie, TV show, musical group, or sports team. You can give me more than one. You can give me one at least. What do you got, Jody?
Easy. Red Sox.
The Red Sox. No thinking about it. She was just ready off the top of that.
And being a Boston sports fan says a lot about me. I mean, I think it explains a lot anyway about me.
Before we get to the campaign itself, you've been working on jail, prison, and sentencing reform before you even started that. So what captured your interest and passion in this area? What did the young Jody, how did she get interested in all of this stuff?
Yeah, I think it's a few things. When I was in college, I went to a Jesuit school and, we had a course basically teaching us to oppose the death penalty, right? Like a lot of teachers or professors like to give you both sides of an issue. That was not the case in this class. It was really clear that we were being taught to oppose the death penalty. And it was through reading Sister Helen Prejean's book, that Dead Man Walking, that I came to feel like, oh yeah, wait, we've really failed a lot of people. And that this idea that we're using, the government to kill other human beings just didn't sit well. And especially in the context of understanding these people's lives and what came before they committed harm themselves. So that really sort of lit a fire. And then after college, I went and joined the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, and I lived in LA. And I volunteered in the LA juvenile halls and got to know these kids that were locked up there and felt like if I had been in their circumstances growing up, I'd be in the very same place. The truth of the matter was that they were in circumstances I couldn't have fathomed as a child, and that, they were faced with choices that were all bad choices, right? And people say, oh, well, kids know right from wrong. Well, when every choice in front of you is a wrong choice and you have very little access to something positive, it was just clear to me, like, I would have made the same choices. And yet, here these kids were, most of them, Black and brown children in these orange jumpsuits being shackled to and from the chapel. I mean, it was just barbaric. We had just clearly lost all sight of the fact that these were children. And I'll never forget a kid that I worked with one day looking me in the eyes and saying, I have no hope for my life. And it just broke my heart. I was like, boy, this is, yet another group of people. We have just completely failed, right? Like, these are children that have no hope growing up in the United States of America. So that was where it began. And, after that, I just knew I wanted to advocate for those young people.
So you launched the campaign for fair sentencing of youth in 2009, like I said, a few years separated from a Supreme Court decision in Roper v. Simmons, which we'll talk some more about other cases, but this is the one that kind of got the ball rolling on a very long run of juvenile related decisions. And this one banned the juvenile death penalty. So I guess I'm just curious to the origin story for the campaign, especially in light of that. how do you decide to kind of go it alone? Who was along for
Yeah.
the ride? Who were your mentors? And I guess also more particularly, whether it was a debate at the time to go so myopically towards that one part of the system, right? Like the issue
Yeah.
of kids, being sentenced to forever in prison
Right.
as opposed to a bigger picture thing.
Yeah. So, I was working at the ACLU at that time when Roper came down, and on, prison conditions issues primarily. And in 2009, that's when a group of folks had come together who had worked to end the juvenile death penalty. They had raised some money to launch the campaign and basically had given some sort of framework to what the position would look like, that I then applied for, not realizing exactly that I was potentially going to be running an organization. That I thought I was like helping to lead a national campaign to end this egregious practice. And the people involved had been, from Human Rights Watch, Allison Parker, Elizabeth Calvin, Brian Stevenson at EJI, Deb LaBelle up in Michigan, Bernadine Dorn. They had been the ones who were, and Sarah Breyer, a whole host of folks who had come together to sort of decide that they wanted a national initiative to end juvenile life without parole. And so then I was hired to sort of get it off the ground. And I think, the rationale was, we can learn a lot from what, and build on the progress from Roper, recognizing now we have this jurisprudence from the Supreme Court saying that kids are different, let's build on that. And also that we had this other extreme sentence that was, a sentence to die in prison that we were imposing on young people that flew in the face of, human rights law and everything we know about young people and their capacity for change. And so there was a desire to end this egregious human rights abuse and use it as a way to open the door and catalyze broader change, right? Life without parole can only be rationalized if these children are not seen as children, right? Like, so who are we talking about? We're talking about predominantly kids of color, being demonized, dehumanized. The super predator theory, of course, played a central role in creating and exacerbating, these policies, creating the political will to have these kinds of extreme sentences. And so there was a need to really humanize this population of kids who committed the most serious crimes. Because if you humanize them, then, it's possible, makes it easier to humanize others. And life without parole as a sentence, right? Like that's the ceiling of a very punitive system as a whole. So we felt like if we can lower that ceiling, you can lower it for everybody, but you've got to start with kids because they're more sympathetic. If you can't get it for kids, you're not going to get it for adults. And we've seen over the years how that has proven to be the case, right? Like we've seen states move to ban life without parole for children and then push further up to age 25 and get review, second look bills that have followed our wins, which has been absolutely crucial. And similarly, we've seen, transfer laws change in some states in California, after they banned juvenile life without parole, because there was all this understanding around adolescent development, who these kids are. So using that sort of egregious sentence as a way both to ban it, but also as a way to sort of open the door to these broader issues has been, I think, core to our strategy since the beginning.
Yeah, let's talk about your strategy. What are the weapons that the campaign deploys in this work? What are the different ways
Yeah.
to come at this?
So for us, we've been very much focused on legislative change in the states, and to some degree at the federal level, and also partnering with lawyers challenging these sentences in court, including all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and using strategic communications to shape narratives about who these kids are and why we need to change these laws. I think the most important part of the work, and our approach has been centering those directly impacted. So since the time I was hired, I mentioned all these advocates who had sort of raised the money to launch the campaign, but the truth of the matter is the families were the ones who are already at it, right? The families, the moms, the people who had loved ones who were given these extreme sentences as children, who were like, I'm not letting my child die there. So when I first started, there was this long email list of families, and they knew what was going on around the country and still do. And so, we launched a national family network early on my first year, at the campaign. And then years later, we launched what is now the Incarcerated Children's Advocacy Network. It was co-founded with my now co-executive director, Xavier McElrath-Bay. And the point of that was really to help sort of center the experience of people who went to prison as children for serious crimes, turn their lives around, were home, and, real examples of how wrongheaded it was to condemn a child to die in prison.
Yeah, because the research is pretty like we don't have a ton of it, but the what studies have been done, it's pretty low recidivism for people
Right,
who are
exactly.
released after getting this. Yeah.
Exactly. And they all brought stories, to legislatures, to editorial boards, even in amicus briefs to the courts about what their experiences were like as children, what it was like to go to prison as a child, what it was like to adult prison as a child, to grow up in an adult prison, and then to come out on the other side of that with a desire to live out this eternal apology, give back to their communities, help make sure young people weren't making the same mistakes they were. Truly these stories of redemption that have captured so many hearts and minds. And that's really why I think we've had the kind of progress that we have.
So a year after you guys started this, I think this case had already been going on, but the next Supreme Court case in this little line here is Graham v. Florida. The court says, no life without parole sentences for youth who commit non-homicides. So we're moving away from death penalty. Now we're into non-homicides, relatively small group within the bigger picture, but talk about a much bigger one that comes down the line pretty soon. But, it just occurred to me kind of preparing to talk to you about all this history, what a sliding doors moment that opinion was for you guys. Cause don't you feel like if that goes the other way and the Supreme Court kind of shuts the door on what had started, what is the campaign about? I certainly doubt that you guys would have taken your ball and gone home, but it would be a different thing, right? I mean,
yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and at the time, I think we were happy certainly with the victory, but we also wanted more. We certainly wanted the court to go further. It was almost a disappointment that they stopped at non-homicides. But yeah, no, of course. I mean, you're absolutely right. If they had said, yeah, no, this is constitutional for non-homicides, then we would have immediately had to switch to the state by state strategies. But yeah, no, I think it was mostly very helpful in terms of wind at our backs, but it also meant some states were like, well, then it's fine for homicides. Right? The court said it's not okay for non-homicides. So then it's fine for homicides, right? Let's make sure that's clear in our statute, right? And so we immediately were sort of on the defense, even coming off that victory.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. No, it certainly would have made things a lot harder if they hadn't given us that.
So then fast forward 3 years, 2012, the Miller decision comes out, and this says no mandatory JLWOP sentences, juvenile life without parole. That's shorthand. Period. No mandatory structures can lead to that. You can do it, but you can't be required to do it. There's got to be some discretion, by the judge or jury, I guess. And I'll just add now, so we don't have to keep just going down memory lane of cases, because that's not all I want to talk to Jody about. That 4 years later, there's another ruling called Montgomery, and that the court basically says what we did in Miller is retroactive. So anyone doing a JLWOP sentence related to this mandatory scheme, that has to be reconsidered. Okay. So this is a much bigger deal, right? At the time of the decision, how many people were doing JLWOP sentences connected to a mandatory scheme? Do you
yeah, I mean, the majority, the vast majority, right? Yeah, that's an important point, right? Graham really had a limited scope in terms of the number of people it impacted, narrowly speaking, but Miller had a much broader scope, in terms of the strict juvenile life without parole cases. And I think there was also a clear argument, coming out of Miller that it should be applied to de facto cases in some places. And so, and also, certainly with Montgomery, it was the vast majority of kids, it's unconstitutional to impose a life without parole sentence on the vast majority of children. I mean, that was really clarified in Montgomery. And that's really where I think we had the most ability to kind of move with the court decisions into the states to help the states figure out what to do in their state
Yeah,
legislatures.
did that really change like the work of the organization? I mean, did you shift from kind of more top line advocacy to like almost direct service, like TA
Yeah,
and stuff?
that's a great question. I mean, once people started coming home, I mean, there were a few things. One was after Montgomery, I mean, to some degree after Miller, there was a need to get people represented to be able to go back before the courts to be resentenced.
Mhm.
That obviously was not an automatic process by any means. In some states, there's no right to counsel, and you have to, find all the people who are eligible, get them lawyers. And so it's a huge effort. And then there was that question that was coming up in different states around retroactivity, and it was being split, and it took too long, in my opinion, for the court to straighten that out, And so by the time Montgomery came around, we had a sense like, okay, we have to get, we work with state partners and, Juvenile Law Center and EJI and others who were trying to figure out how to get people represented and back into court. And of course, in like Pennsylvania, I think they had something like 60 days to get back into court after the decision came down. So, then it was really about trying to make sure as folks started to come home, we really recognized like things are not easy for these folks. Like
Yeah.
growing up in prison is a unique experience, and being told you're going to die there and then coming home, like that was just, you couldn't just slap, any kind of reentry services on this, issue and have it solved, right? Like we had to really, and that's where ICANN came in. Like really, it was so important to have a community for these people to join, a place they could go where people understood their experience. And it really proved invaluable. And meanwhile, the work in the states to get the state legislatures to adopt, the kinds of reforms we wanted to see, because we didn't want it to just be narrow. We didn't want it to just include the mandatory juvenile life without parole cases. We wanted it to include discretionary de facto cases, So it was a lot of effort, to try to get states to move
Was
in
that
that.
yeah, what is the kind of sales pitch to a state when you're trying to give it like, look, this is where this is at now, but you might as well just ban it because this isn't gonna stop, like they're just gonna keep reviewing this stuff. Is that
Yeah, no, I mean, that was it. I mean, it was sort of taking the language and recognition of where we were and, trying, I mean, truth of the matter is you don't want to be litigating these issues forever, making it more complicated and drawing all these lines, didn't seem worthwhile for anybody. And so, I think that was one of the arguments. I mean, I think it was also really just making sure we were working with legislators who understood like what this reform was really about and why it meant all kids under 18, as a starting point anyway, needed to have hope and a meaningful shot at coming home in their lifetimes, and ideally sooner than later, because, we had, this is where ICANN again was so helpful, people who came home, in their 20s and 30s were able to start lives and careers and, families. And not to say that people can't do that in their 50s, but it's a lot easier to do when you're in your 20s and 30s. And so that was part of, the argument going in. It's like, listen, we don't want review after 30 years. We want review after 10 or 15 max, you don't always get that because of what's feasible politically, but we certainly had, the arguments for it, and in large part because of the role of our ICANN members.
I'm sure every state that has moved, and we'll talk a little bit more about the total track record in a second, but like every one of them that moves towards a ban has felt like a great win for you. But is there one that sticks out where, I don't know, maybe you didn't think the chance of success is high, or,
Yeah.
you really felt like we did this, like the campaign was really a big part of this?
Well, so I'll say, I mean, California was a huge victory. That was in 2012, right just months after Miller came down. And that wasn't CFSY, like the campaigns doing, like we didn't lead on that. That was Elizabeth Calvin, Human Rights Watch, and the team in California. We had an organizer who basically lived in California and did whatever she told him to do.
Nice.
But like, that was like, every year we got so close. We were within, a vote or two. And then finally getting that across the finish line was huge, in part because of the number of people impacted, but also because, California has just been historically so punitive. And so a win there really was, so significant in terms of what it meant nationally. One of our first victories that I remember, being particularly excited about was winning in West Virginia, of all places. Like, we got a bill passed there early on that created review after no more than 15 years for every child in the adult system, and that just felt significant because it was like, this is we had to have bipartisan support, as we did everywhere. And, being able to do that somewhere that, is purple at best, felt really, exciting early on. Arkansas was another state that really stood out, where we worked with a legislator who originally was our most fervent opposition. I mean, she had lost a loved one to violence, and she was the person everybody went to say, well, what do victims think? And she killed our bill the first year we were there. And then we went back, and she sat down with people we worked with. She sat down with Xavier. She sat down with a woman named Linda White, who's now a board member of ours, who I've been working with since 2009, whose daughter was killed by two teens. And the three of them sat together and had a real heart-to-heart alongside our advocacy director who orchestrated this, who's, a brilliant strategist and now runs Human Rights for Kids, James Dold. And they had this meeting where they talked about the power of redemption and their faith and all these things as moms, and she left that meeting saying she wanted to sponsor our bill. And off it went. Subsequently, some of the people who've come home in Arkansas then went back and partnered with those same legislators to continue moving the ball so that they weren't dealing with lifetime parole and other issues. So, I mean, Arkansas, interestingly, and being, again, not your bastion of liberalism, it being a southern state was really significant.
Join Fostering Media Connections on Thursday, October 12th for Education Inside and Out, an online conversation about what we know and what we're trying when it comes to educating youth who experience incarceration. This great panel is going to tell you about brand new research around education and juvenile justice. You'll hear from pioneers working with teachers on ways to engage and inspire students in juvenile facilities. And we'll learn about a recent movement in California to get incarcerated youth and young adults on the college track. Join us on Thursday, October 12th, 1 p.m. Pacific Time, 4 p.m. Eastern Time. This event is completely free thanks to our sponsor, the California Wellness Foundation. To register, just visit the link in the show notes on this episode or visit imprintnews.org/webinars. So the sort of where it stands in states today, and by the way, I would recommend the campaign has a great website, very easy data. You don't have to go hunting around. A lot of it, it's just like right there on the homepage. It's very helpful. Yeah. 28 states have banned juvenile life without parole. 5 basically are like quasi in that still allowed, but nobody's actually in on a jail web sentence. And then there's 22 states that still allow it. So when you look at the map, it's basically like all of the mid and southeast that still allow it. And then the Great Lakes region, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Illinois, and Indiana, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And then you got a few others kind of flung around there. But I was just curious for your thoughts on like the cluster areas there, the Great Lakes and the mid and southeast. What is it about those regions that make having that power to do this important? Or do you just think it's, it's there and it's just it's hard to change? Just like no one really loves it. It's just there. And so.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, it definitely varies. I mean, I think Michigan is a place Michigan currently has more people serving juvenile life without parole than anywhere else in the world, right? So
which is shocking. Sorry to interrupt, but very shocking also in the context of probably, would you say that Debbie is the longest running advocate pushing against this?
Oh, Deb Lavelle, yeah, for sure.
It's weird that the state that has the most fervent dug-in person pushing against it is that. Strange. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. No. I mean, it's obviously not the only thing she's been working on. She's, taken on, Flint Water and, Planned Parenthood and various other, important causes there. But But yeah, no, I mean, I think Michigan, I mean, one of the problems I think in Michigan is that the prosecutors have used it for so long and it's a tool in their toolbox, right? And that there are some prosecutors there that, have really, and law enforcement community members who've really stood staunchly by this practice, right? Like, despite there being bipartisan efforts there to change it. I think the fact that there are so many folks home there gives me hope because as I've said, I think they're absolutely crucial to changing the hearts and minds and building political will for a better way. And so, I am hopeful. We do have a bipartisan bill pending there now. We're, of course, all of us in this climate of sort of polarization as well as, upticks in crime in some places. And so that is not an easy environment to be in working on these issues. But we have seen, we banned juvenile life without parole in 3 states just this year. So in Illinois, they passed a bill, New Mexico passed a bill, Minnesota passed a bill. So, I think there is still an appetite. And, I think moving some of these big states like Michigan, I mean, look, Michigan, Louisiana, Pennsylvania, Florida, and California were the big 5 back in the day, right? Like they had the most people serving. 2/3 of the population given juvenile life without parole were in those 5 states. California is the only one of those that has done any sort of meaningful reform. Pennsylvania has had progress through the courts primarily, limited progress there. Obviously, they've resentenced a lot of people, and in part because they are, in a place where the DA wasn't going to oppose a lot of the resentencings, and understandably so. These people who've come home are contributing members of society doing extraordinarily well against, all odds. So, I think the places that have a history of using these the most are going to be difficult to move. In the South, obviously, there are a whole host of issues in terms of the makeup of the legislatures, what the priorities are there. I think Louisiana has come close. They've made, incremental progress there. Florida even had some incremental progress. They've backtracked recently, unfortunately. But I think the truth is that, having more folks home, and I really believe that has to be part of our strategy in especially some of those southern states where judges just don't want to let people out. Like we have to come up with ways to get folks out, because I do see that as being such a crucial part of the legislative change. Is like, you just have to know these people, you have to see these people, you have to recognize that their worst thing doesn't have to define them. Their worst act back when they were 16-year-old hot-headed teens in conditions that none of us want to be living in, that doesn't have to define who they are. And it certainly hasn't in the vast majority of these cases. And so I think there's a lot, that we need to do to build political will in those places. And it helps that we have, our street and Right on Crime and others who are, Americans for Prosperity. They all support this effort. But at the end of the day, it's about priorities and what the state's going to prioritize getting done.
So there's like a little more than 500 people doing, life without parole off of juvenile offenses now. I think that's down quite a bit since before Miller. There was almost 3,000. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, about 100, there's only really been like 100 of these sentences since Miller. So while there's all these states that still have it, they must be doing it less, right? I mean, even the states you're describing where it's pretty dug in, there's no way they are doing it with the same fervor they were before.
That's right. I think that's right. Generally speaking, I think the tenor has changed a bit in a lot of places. We also have seen different elections around who the prosecutors are in a lot of these places, right? And that matters. Judges, being educated on these issues. And that's part of our implementation efforts has been to create bench cards for judges, explaining to them what do these court decisions mean and how do you think about them differently when you see a child coming up charged with murder. So, I think there's a lot of different, and the efforts around transfer and ending transfer, right? Like if you have fewer kids going into the adult system, if you have other ways of dealing with them, like all of that makes the conditions better in terms of how the sort of outcomes that we're going to see. But yeah, I think it remains, I think, a stain that on our record that we have this sentence available to children, right? Like, I think that's the piece that like I still sit with and the people who are still whose families I've been working alongside for all this time, it's so joyful. I mean, you mentioned earlier the milestone. I don't know if I'm allowed to say what it is, but
Oh yeah, let's talk about it now. I
yeah,
had to say it for later, but
yeah.
it's yeah, you tell them. I think you'll do a better job articulating.
Just last month, we celebrated that 1,000 people who were given life without parole as children are free. Many of them are people, I remember writing to over the years, and at a time when there was just so little hope, and the idea that now they're free and they're with their loved ones. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And there are still many of them behind the wall. Either they've been resentenced to something else and they're getting, denied parole because the parole boards haven't been changed enough. I mean, there's just so many things that I think this issue, again, sort of going back to where we started, this issue highlights so many problems with our system and remains, somehow our country can stomach the idea that we condemn children to die in prison, and we're the only country in the world that does this. So that to me is continuing to drive me in the work, because I feel like we're better than that, and we have to be. And as long as this barbaric sentence exists, it's Black and brown children who are disproportionately going to get it, and continues to rationalize a punitive system across the board that serves none of us.
You kind of alluded to this, and I just remember after the Graham decision back in 2010, talking to one of the attorneys involved, and them expressing, I'm sorry, it wasn't Brian Stevenson, and it was one of the other attorneys. I can't remember his name right now, but
Brian Gowdy.
yes,
Yeah.
steel trap there, Jody. Good memory.
Yeah.
That one of the things they would have their eye on and they were worried about was essentially that they would go from having JL-WOP sentences to what I think he described as like functionally life without parole.
Yep.
So no JL-WOP, but 80 years without the possibility of parole. So I guess like what, that was an early prophecy. What has replaced JL-WOP?
Yeah.
Are some states subbing in absurdly long finite
Yeah.
sentences?
Well, first of all, so that was Brian Gowdy was Terrence Graham's attorney. Terrence Graham is still in prison. Evan Miller is still in prison. Henry Montgomery did over 55 years, was denied parole twice before he was released. So like, I just, progress does not mean justice by any stretch. It is a less harsh system, and we can celebrate that, and we can celebrate the freedom of these people who are home and recognize the injustice of how long they served. To answer your question, I mean, we have been working to make sure our legislative efforts are really trying to cap the number of years at anywhere from, 15 to 20 years for any child in the adult system, right? So again, progress, not justice. It is still barbaric to think of a child getting a 20-year sentence. Unfortunately, they're still getting far worse. But, we've seen the power of making that progress and, having folks return home and how important that is, even if it isn't everything we want. So it's a lot to hold, and we all feel very conflicted every step of the way. But I can say that like, it absolutely has been worth it to bring these folks home. And the 1,000 isn't the de facto cases. Those are just the juvenile life without parole cases. There are hundreds and hundreds of others. Like here in Washington, D.C., we didn't count them in our state, the state count, because technically it's not a state, but there's 28 states in Washington, D.C. that ban. And technically DC didn't have JL-WOP, but they had life for children, and that could have effectively become life without for a lot of them. So we have, I think, 70 something folks home here in DC that aren't counted in that 1,000 total. So that's just in DC. And so everywhere that we've been able to pass bills that apply to these sort of de facto cases or to all kids in the adult system, we've started to see more and more folks home. We just have only kept a tally on the juvenile life cases because that's all that we've had in our database.
Okay, so you're stepping out of the leadership at the campaign, but you're sticking around. You're hoping to work on some stuff. What's next for you, Jody?
Yeah, so a lot of this is still being figured out. I mean, I think one of the things that I have been particularly interested in recent years, especially, is this question of what do we do instead, right? Like, what do we do with young people who commit murder? I don't think we have adequately, as a field, really teed up what we want. And I think, sort of going back to that question earlier about like, what can we stomach, and like, are they getting other extreme sentences in place of this? The truth is, it's really hard. Like, the more these people I meet, the more proximate I am to these communities and these individuals, the harder it is to stomach the idea that we're condemning any child to 10, 20 years in adult prison, period. And I don't think it's what I don't think it's what we need. I know it's not what we need. And I think we're at a point where more Americans than ever before don't trust the current criminal legal system, but they don't know what to do instead, right? Like, we don't have things at our fingertips to point to, especially when it comes to serious crimes like murder. And so, I think what I hope to do is spend more time with some of the ICANN members that I know who are working in the communities trying to build those kinds of solutions in various respects that don't rely on extreme sentences, right? Like, that look to restorative justice models as a way to, ensure accountability, provide healing, restore communities. I mean, those are all the things we need. And the truth is that the solutions to get us there really have been under-resourced and outside the spotlight, even for us advocates. I would, be hard-pressed to go into a legislature and say an end to juvenile life without parole, and we need this restorative justice program instead that does X, Y, and Z, and here's the data. Like, we don't have all that teed up, and we need it. And that's where I want to spend my time. I want to spend my time with the people who've been impacted, who know better than anybody else what we need when young people commit harm and don't have access to the resources and don't have access to the media in the same way that others do. And so it has been the honor of a lifetime to lead at the CFSY. My team and the people I've worked with over the years are just some of the most incredible human beings on the planet. About half of our staff now are directly impacted, maybe more. A number of our board members as well, people on our staff who I used to write letters to in prison, and they were serving life without parole. And now they, like, my deputy director at the campaign, was a juvenile lifer. So, being part of that community is not something I'm going to give up, but I recognize that there is a need for even deeper leadership of our directly impacted folks and more space, in the organization and in leadership to have the ideas of people impacted be the way forward. And so that's really been my motivation for stepping down, is to create that space and to let them shine and do the brilliant things that they're capable of doing. And I'll be there cheering them along every step of the way as I work closely, hopefully, with these community members who are building the public safety solutions I believe we need.
Jody Kent Lavy, co-founder, Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth. Thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thanks, John.
Thanks to Jody Kent Lavy of the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or Safe Camp Audio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it's super easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always email us at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.